In the 1490s, the Portuguese sailed around Africa and reached India, because I'm standing in a former Portuguese colony here in Goa. But they didn't stop at India. By the 15 teens, they'd reached China, and by the mid-1500s, they'd reach Japan. And wherever the Portuguese merchants and explorers went, the missionaries went too, and they proselytized for 50 years. And by 1600, there were something like 300,000 Christians in Japan. Of course, we're talking almost exclusively here southern Japan, Kyushu. This is where the Portuguese were trading from. And most of these, we would assume, were genuine conversions. I mean, tens of thousands of these people will be willing to die for their faith later on. We'll get to that in a second. There were other motivations too. Now you can look at the Daimyo of Nagasaki, for example, and this is sort of a pattern we see. A daimyo will convert, or samurai will convert, and then loyal followers will convert. But there's no reason to think that many of these, if not most of these, weren't genuine. That said, you look at someone like the Daimyo of Nagasaki. Nagasaki was nothing but like a fishing village. It was small, it was nothing. But that relationship with the Portuguese had economic and military benefits attached to it. You convert to Christianity, you deal with the Portuguese, and now your little fishing village of Nagasaki becomes a major trading depot, major trading hub. So it's very lucrative to become a Christian in that case. Not to mention that the Portuguese were willing to lend their military might to the Daimyo over Nagasaki vis-a-vis his, Daimyo opponents. So there are many benefits to becoming Christian. That said, of these hundreds of thousands, many proved their willingness to lay down their lives for their newly adopted faith. Now, Oda Nobunaga was inclined to look favorably upon the faith. If you think about it, he's sort of famous for not getting along with that Buddhist establishment. Here comes the Christians as a possible counterweight. He famously hosted Jesuit priests in Kyoto. He allowed for the establishment of a Christian church in the imperial capital of Kyoto. So that's Oda Nobunaga. And Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who followed him, he too, at first, seems to have been favorably inclined towards Christians. And he once said that the only thing keeping him personally from becoming a Christian was the supposed Christian prohibition on polygamy. Clearly, Toyotomi Hideyoshi changed his mind later, maybe seeing how the Portuguese came to basically control Nagasaki. Eventually he's going to come in there, he's going to seize Nagasaki, and as a warning to others, he's going to crucify and spear the famous 26 martyrs there. So clearly he changes his mind. Then in 1614, Tokugawa Ieyasu officially bans Christianity in Japan. He's looking over at what the Spanish have done in the Philippines. He doesn't want the same sort of thing to happen in Japan. But the real death blow for Christianity in Japan, or at least the near-death blow, came at a place called Shimabara. See, a very ardently anti-Christian local administration at Shimabara ruthlessly carried out the Tokugawa shogunate's anti-Christian policies there, hunting down Christians, executing Christians in large numbers. In fact, by the time of the rebellion, which we're about to talk about, every Christian in the area had officially recanted, had officially denied the faith in order to survive. But beneath the surface, belief in the banned faith system obviously continued. Anyway, very, very bad time if you happen to be a Christian in and around Shimabara. It didn't help that the local administration was trying to carry out these large building projects like the Shimabara Castle, which is amazing. It's a great place. But the building of it, of course, people are taxed to build it. This is very heavy taxation, and if you can't pay the local administration, which has already shown its brutality vis-a-vis the Christians, they're willing to kill you or torture you, abuse your women, sell them to brothels. One day in 1637, the daimyo's thugs go too far. One of them is torturing this guy's daughter. So he's a father watching his daughter get tortured before his very eyes. He rises up in rage and he kills the guy. And pretty soon the entire village is up in arms against the daimyo, and this insurrection grows, and before you know it, you have multiple samurai or ronin, masterless samurai, assuming leadership positions. Most of these guys are Christian. There are some non-Christians. This was a Christian rebellion. Now, it gets categorized. It's not very popular to say that these days. Certainly the spark wasn't, didn't have to do directly with Christianity, but most of its participants were Christian. These guys would yell or shout Christian slogans, the name of Jesus, the name of Mary, as they're mounting an attack. There's Christian symbols on their banners. We're talking decades of angst against anti-Christian government policies. Definitely, if it doesn't start out as a Christian revolt, it assumes the nature of a Christian revolt. It becomes a Christian revolt. There are heavy Christian overtones to the whole thing. But regardless, you've got these samurai or ronin taking leadership positions, most of whom are Christian. Most of the participants are Christian. The daimyo send their forces to combat the rebels, and they're consistently beaten off. And eventually the shogun himself sends a commissioner with an army to take down the revolt, and it is beaten back. This sort of rebellion, this sort of revolt against Tokugawa authority, one the likes of which the government had never faced before in its short existence. It had only been around for about 15 years. This was a real challenge to them. And you can see how much of a challenge it was in the size of the army that was mustered to take care of the Shimabara Rebellion. Keep in mind there are about 27,000 rebels, mostly non-warriors, down here causing a ruckus. And the Tokugawa shogunate organizes an army of 100,000 troops. This is an army that will grow to about 200,000 by the end of the suppression of the revolt. So these are massive numbers. This is a type of army that European countries at the time probably couldn't have mustered for any reason, let alone to put down a little rebellion. But this was important to the legitimacy of the newly established shogunate. And so a huge force was mustered, came here to Shimabara, and actually this castle was besieged by the rebels of Shimabara, but their last stand was made at a castle. If you go down the coastline here about 15 miles, there's a castle called Hara Castle, and there the rebels made their last stand. They lasted for about 3 months, and finally starvation caused their downfall. The Edo troops, which had tried to overcome the castle time and time again but been beaten back, now they're facing starved and dying people. They're able to overrun Hara Castle, and they kill every man, woman, and child. Later they'll behead thousands more Christians. They'll force out, deport thousands more Christians to the Philippines, to Macau. They'll pressure others to move. And this turns out to be the real nail in the coffin for Christianity in Japan during this early period. However modern historians might argue about the nature of the Shimabara revolt, was it a Christian revolt? Was it a tax revolt? Was it a mix? Was it something else? There's no question when it comes to what the Tokugawa shogunate thought the revolt was all about. This was a clear indication in the eyes of the shogunate of the dangers of Christianity. And so the original ban on Christianity was reinforced, it was reiterated, and this time it would be strictly enforced. To be a Christian was punishable by death. Contact with the outside world was going to be cut off. And of course, this is a process that's been going on for years, but the Shimabara revolt brought that process to its consummation. Contact with Europeans would be virtually completely cut off. Even Western books would be banned. Of all the Europeans, only the Dutch were given trading rights with Japan, and they were very, very restricted trading rights. They were allowed to trade through one little man-made island in Nagasaki harbor called Daimyo, but that's it. And the only reason the Dutch were allowed to trade with the Japanese is because the Dutch had helped put down the Shimabara Rebellion. You've got Dutch ships using cannon fire on Hara Castle, where the rebels were holed up for 3 months. They're bombarding the castle at the behest of the shogun. Of course, the Dutch are Protestants, and they're used to fighting Catholics in Europe, so I guess they have no problem, using cannon fire on Japanese Catholics here in Japan. When the Portuguese, at least a group of Portuguese merchants, tried to come back a year later on a ship, they were all beheaded by the shogunate. The failure of the Shimabara revolt of 1637 to 1638 marks the end of what scholars call the Christian century, and the beginning of a 250-year period of systematic suppression of Christianity by the regime. We call this period the underground period, and the Christians of this time, hidden Christians. And the Tokugawa shogunate had its ways of ferreting out these hidden Christians, particularly using fumiye meaning treading on pictures or something like that. Basically, this is a ritual meant to root out Christians. You've got these pictures of Jesus on the cross or the Virgin Mary or whatever, And if you're willing to tread on them, well, then you must not be an adherent of the banned faith. But in this way, they were able to ferret out some Christians. And over time, particularly in the decades after Shimabara, the Tokugawa shogunate executed thousands. It's not really until the 1870s that Christians can practice more openly. And it's not until 1890 that the ban on Christianity is officially lifted from the books. On August 9th, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, a plutonium bomb, on Nagasaki, Japan's most Christian city. And Ground Zero was the most Christian district of that city, the Urakami district. In fact, this cathedral behind me, Urakami Cathedral, St. Mary's, this was Ground Zero. The bomb exploded several hundred feet above this cathedral. Of course, it was destroyed. This is a rebuilt version. There are still a few stone remains that you can view here in Nagasaki, but this was it. And the several hundred worshippers who were at that moment in Mass, participating in Mass, were all incinerated on the spot. Christian girls' school was destroyed, several orders of nuns were destroyed, and the majority of Nagasaki's Christians were killed. Of course, about 100,000 people in Nagasaki died in the attack, but a majority of Nagasaki's Christians died on that one day. In fact, in those few moments. In the words of one scholar, what the Japanese imperial government could not do in 250 years, ironically, a few American Christians did in mere seconds. Today, about 1% of Japan is Christian.